Okay, so now that we got the introduction out of the way, we'll look at our sort of first example of imperial expansion in the case of Spain and Portugal. Now, in our first lecture 2 weeks ago, we talked a lot about the crisis of feudalism. Our focus was on specifically how England dealt with the crisis of feudalism, how that crisis of feudalism eventually led to the emergence of commercial agriculture on the English countryside. And we saw how in response to the greater power that the peasantry commanded after the demographic collapse in which almost 50% of the population was wiped out, this sort of resulting class struggle emerged between the nobility's efforts to further squeeze the peasantry and the peasantry's efforts, given their sort of newfound power, to bargain for better conditions. And this led to a revolt. Now, what the unintended consequences of it was greater land consolidation amongst the landlord class, who were able to take over land that were occupied previously by peasants who had died during the plague. Now, what this led to eventually was the kind of new nexus of landlord-tenant wage labor and the emergence of commercial capitalism. And because of that, because these sort of imperatives of capitalism started to drive greater sort of incentives towards efficiencies, all of a sudden the labor force started to shrink even more, and these sort of peasants moved into cities, and centuries later would eventually form the backbone of what would become the English working class, and by the 19th century, the wage workers of industrial England. Now, of course, this crisis of feudalism was not just an English phenomenon. It was a European-wide phenomenon. The French dealt with it differently. What happened in the crisis of feudalism in France was the emergence of the absolutist state, reaching its sort of zenith under Louis XIV and then lasting until 1789, when the French Revolution deposed Louis XVI. Now, a lot of what the absolutist state was, I'm not going to get into it a lot here, we'll talk about it later when we look at liberal democratic revolutions, was in some ways, as I said last class, very similar to what the Sung and the Ming dynasties were doing in China. That basically, the French dealt with it by the central government in their effort to raise more revenue because of lost revenue in that crisis of feudalism, basically went around the middleman, in this case, the local landlord, and started squeezing the peasantry directly, much like Sung and Ming China. But there were other nations in Europe that were also trying to solve this crisis of feudalism. Because what I said earlier was baked into this crisis of feudalism was declining revenue for the central government. And another option, instead of doing what the English did unintentionally or doing what the French did very much intentionally, was to look abroad for greater sources of revenue. If securing revenue from agricultural surplus was proving difficult or untenable, well, they could do what the Italian city-states were doing, specifically Venice. Especially owed its wealth almost entirely through trade, specifically trade in spices and slaves with the Islamic Empire. So this is what Spain and Portugal eventually looked to do. But there was a big problem. Venice had a near monopoly on trade with the Islamic Empire. It wouldn't be lucrative to have to go through Venice to make all this money. And then when the Venetian power started to wane later on, the Ottoman Empire emerged as this sort of great power. So the problem was that in order to make money from trade, you had to figure out a way around the Ottomans and the Venetians. So what to do? So if the Spanish and Portuguese crowns wanted to raise money by seeking out new riches of the each, they would have to find a way around. Now, it is the Portuguese here that take the lead. The Spanish were largely preoccupied with the reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula for much of the 15th century. Though 1492 is often synonymous with Columbus's famous voyage to where he lands in the Caribbean, it is also the year that the Spanish Christian forces defeated the last vestige of the great kingdom of Al-Andalus, which for centuries was the most cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and advanced society in Europe. So the Portuguese began looking sort of southwest. They look out toward the Atlantic, first reaching the Azores, and then in 1434 was a sort of key turning point. It marked the first really long voyage from the Portuguese mainland when they reached Cape Verde, which is off the coast of modern-day Senegal. And this would culminate eventually in 1498 when Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, modern-day Cape Town, and entered the Indian Ocean trading world. Now, at this time, part of the reason it took Portugal so long to finally get around the Cape of Good Hope was nobody really knew how far south Africa went. Now, when Vasco da Gama entered the Indian Ocean in 1498, it fundamentally altered the economic history of the world. In many ways, da Gama's entry into the Indian Ocean is just as important and sort of world-changing than Columbus's landing in 1492. But we'll talk more about about the Portuguese a little bit later. But before that, we'll go back 6 years to that famous date when the newly united crown of Castile and Aragon, forming what would become the modern nation of Spain, had finally succeeded in defeating the last Islamic stronghold, the Emirate of Granada. And after centuries of war, were looking for a way out of the crisis of feudalism. They were looking to raise revenue. They were exhausted at this point. And this is the same year that a Genoese merchant named Christopher Columbus, or as the Spanish called him, Christopher Colon, approached King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella and proposed that he could reach the east looking for gold and spices by going west. Contrary to what many assume, no one believed that the world was flat. Everybody knew it was round. In fact, the ancient Greeks knew it was round. It's just that they thought it was a lot smaller than it was. They didn't count on, and specifically Columbus, certainly didn't count on stumbling upon another continent. Indeed, Columbus, after 4 major voyages, as you can see on the map here on the slide, the last one being 1502 to 1504, which was the only one where he really reached the mainland of the Americas. For the most part, he mostly settled in islands of the Caribbean, modern-day Cuba, Bahamas, Hispaniola, which is where modern-day the Dominican Republic and Haiti are. He died having never known he discovered a new continent. He always thought he had found a route to India, which of course is why he referred to the inhabitants of the Caribbean islands as Indians, and the name stuck. But it would take a little bit longer for this investment in westward trade to pay off. And it would pay off initially with Hernando Cortez, a famous conquistador, in 1519, when he landed in what is today modern Veracruz, New Mexico. Now, Cortez, with a small band of soldiers on horseback, as he moved inland, made contact with locals, and he heard of a great city and empire further inland. And when he reached Tenochtitlan, the great city that he heard of about 150,000 people ruling over an empire of upwards of possibly 20 million. Some estimates suggest that central Mexico had a population as high as 35 million when the Spanish arrived. And essentially, the Spanish were able to, with very few soldiers, lop the head off the empire. They killed Montezuma and basically took control of a pre-existing imperial structure. And from there, they were able to send back gold and silver. You can see here is a slide of Cortez and the Spanish greeting Montezuma. Okay. And this wasn't the only thing. About 15 years later, in 1532, after the Spanish had heard of another great empire to the south, Francisco Pizarro conquered what was at the time the Incan Empire in what is now modern-day Peru in a very similar way in context to the way that the Spanish conquered the Aztecs, by basically holding the leader hostage and demanding to take control, which they eventually did. Now, what evolved in the Spanish imperial system at this time was what you could probably call what sort of French historian Pierre Villard calls the highest stage of feudalism. It was essentially an export of feudalism to the Americas. They basically exported that system and tried to set it up in Mexico and then eventually Peru. What evolved was the encomienda system. And the encomienda basically was translating feudalism to the New World. They gave large chunks of lands to a royal follower to defend and hold that land in the name of the crown. That follower would collect tribute from sort of local networks of indigenous people, promote conversion, and in payment he would keep part of that tribute for himself and then send the bulk of it back to Spain. Now, initially, the royal court in Madrid tried to ensure this would not be hereditary. They were concerned about power centers. Remember, this is really far away. It takes months for the Spanish to sail to the Americas. So they were concerned that if you kept a hereditary system, it would create a local power center that would want to detach from Spain. And in many ways, they had good reason, right? This is the same thing that the Chinese emperors and the imperial government were concerned about the emergence of private wealth that was disconnected from the imperial bureaucracy. But the Spanish crown failed in this regard. It was just too far away. And what did emerge was a system of hereditary sort of landed elites, much like existed in feudal Europe at the time. All right. Now that's sort of the first part of looking at Spain and Portugal. And what we're going to look at next, in the next video, is specifically how the sort of colonial economies emerged to become really about the extraction of precious metals, specifically gold and silver.